Aloha! Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. My name is Hillary Weinberg, and this is The Whole Gamut. I'm here with our first return guest, Carl Schuster, retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, who has a great depth and breadth of knowledge of military history as well as current military events. So it's not history. We are making history right now.
Indeed. Well, we're following someone who is.
Right.
Indeed.
So today we're going to talk about Boko Haram. Last week we talked about Hawaii. This week we're talking about Boko Haram, which is a terrorist organization based in Africa, and Carl is going to give us a lot of information about it. So first, can you explain Boko Haram? Just what are the top 3 bullet points we need to know?
Well, first of all, they do not have a global vision for jihad. They are a jihadist organization. They believe in attacking those who do not share their beliefs. But they are limited to the territory of northeast Nigeria, bits of Cameroon, Niger, and Chad. And the reason for that is they're centered on an ethnic group, a tribe, the Kanuri tribesmen, and they're urging or fighting for the rebirth of the Bornu Empire, which was a Muslim empire located in northwestern Africa in the 14th century. And it was conquered by the British in the late 19th century.
So can we see that? It's on slide 3.
Indeed.
We can see a map of the Sultanate of Bornu. And so why is it a sultanate?
It's a sultanate because a caliph is the leader of all the faithful. Mm-hmm. A sultan is the leader of the faithful within a defined geographic area or group. And so Boko Haram has no global aspirations. They are focused on what they consider to be the traditional territory that is rightfully belonging to the Kanuri tribe, which is the tribe that dominates Boko Haram. They feel that they have an inherited right to rule the area of that territory, which on the map is delineated by the dashed black lines. And it's more of a Boko Haram, although they espouse themselves as Islamic. They're actually more of an ethno-fascist group. They don't have a place for leadership among those who are not Kanuri tribesmen.
So this separates them from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which is looking for global expansion and including all Muslims under their umbrella.
That's correct.
So do ISIS and Al-Qaeda include Boko Haram under either their umbrellas?
Yes, they have sworn loyalty to ISIS. Mm-hmm. But that's because they have a common goal. ISIS wants to dominate Northwest Africa. And they have money, weapons, and technical expertise that Boko Haram did not have until they affiliated with the jihadists that were released from Gaddafi's jails in 2011. And so it's more of an alliance of convenience. The international legal term is co-belligerents. They're fighting largely the same enemies, although Boko Haram feels no need to attack Westerners outside of northeast Nigeria and northwestern Chad, although they will conduct kidnappings as a fundraising activity. They've kidnapped about a dozen tourists over the last 4 years, and they ransom them for anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million. They also rob banks, so about half of their attacks are money-making type attacks.
So they're real vigilantes.
Indeed, you could make that argument.
Yeah, so they're out there to cause trouble, right, and to create this larger organization. But I mean, we always have to assume that for them this is logical. They're not just doing this to create chaos. They're doing this for an end goal. And so the end goal, to make sure I understand you, is an ethnic homestead.
Exactly, an ethnic sultanate. Mm-hmm. And the original founder, Muhammad Yusuf, in 2002, he argued that the reason they were poor and the reason that they were largely dispossessed and politically irrelevant is because they lost their moral compass. His initial ideology was actually fairly moderate. We will return to basic fundamentals of Islam, family values. We're going to get away from evolution as an educational topic. We're going to teach it as it is in the Quran. And all these pagan sciences that depict the sun in the center of the solar system, we've been seduced by that, and it has allowed others to dominate our destiny. We have an Allah-given right to rule the territory that we had before the Westerners took it from us. That was his basic ideology.
Okay, so let's go back in history
Mhm.
a bit, have a little bit of a history lesson. So when was the Bornu Empire?
The Bornu Empire was an inheritor of the Kanem Empire, and it ran from about the late 14th century, and in its last vestiges disappeared around 1890.
Okay, and 1890 is when, to refresh our memories, Europe was breaking up Africa.
That's
for
correct.
itself.
The Treaty of Berlin divided Africa among the European powers.
Okay, so we're looking at Niger, Nigeria, and Chad. What were those all British colonies?
No, Chad was French,
Okay,
as is Niger,
okay,
and Cameroon was German until 1918. And so,
Cameroon too, yes.
yeah, Nigeria was British. But the boundaries didn't take into account tribal territories and
Right.
ethnicity. For example, if you look at the map, you'll notice that the Kanuri are a major presence in all four of those regional countries. And because the Bornu Empire, their primary economic activity was the slave trade, you will find Kanuri as far east as Western Ethiopia and Sudan. And so they're quite extended in their reach as an ethnic group, but the largest concentration is in northeastern Nigeria and bits of Niger and Chad, although they only constitute 4% of the population of Nigeria.
Okay, so this is interesting because it reflects a lot of the problems we see in the Middle East today
Mhm.
with the Sykes-Picot Treaty, where these countries were divided along lines that were convenient for the French and the British and whatever other countries were in the area. And then we now see the effects of that, where ethnic groups and religious groups, especially, we're seeing this in Syria, where now people are saying, okay, well, we've been ruling ourselves for a while, and now we want to create our own countries. Now we want to go back to our ethnic groups instead of, let's all get along and, okay, we could have multi-ethnic.
To a great extent, if you look at Syria and Iraq, for example, Syria is in many ways the opposite of Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
The Alawites, which are a sect within the Shia branch of Islam, have ruled Syria since independence, and that's because when the French came, they were an oppressed group. They became loyal to the French. They provided the policemen and the soldiers within the colonial army. So when they gained independence, they had the guns and they had the administration, whereas the Sunni remained aloof and as a result weren't in a position to take over. Iraq was in many ways almost the opposite. The Sunnis were a minority there. They were loyal to the Hashemite king, and the British co-opted them, and the Shia majority was largely dispossessed because at the time the religious leaders in the Shia community felt that becoming leaders in a political sense would corrupt the religion, so they stayed out of it. And then, of course, the Kurds, who resisted the British incorporation of Iraq, eventually were militarily compelled to join, and they find themselves, much like the Kanuri in Africa, divided among about 4 countries.
Right.
And so what's happened here in Nigeria is Yusuf was very charismatic. And
So who is Yusuf? I don't think we've discussed this
Muhammad
yet on the
Yusuf, he's the original founder of Boko
Okay,
Haram.
and where and when is Muhammad Yusuf originating from?
He originally came from the border area with Nigeria and Chad, and he stood up a school, not just a religious school. He had a school for Islamic studies, and he had a school that provided free education for poor people. We don't know where he got his money from, but basically, poor people of the Kanuri extraction would go to his school and they would be taught his form of Islam and how to read, how to write, math, basic educational subjects. He was vehemently opposed to the Western views on science and physics and evolution. And so you got his version of how the earth evolved based on direct literal translation of what's in the Quran, which is very similar to what's in the Old Testament.
It's not even so we're talking about ethnic purity and also religious purity, but also intellectual purity.
Indeed.
We will only think in the way that Muslims think.
Or
in the way the Quran
his construct
right,
of
his
it, absolutely.
construct of it.
And as a result, he was a nuisance. The government considered him a nuisance in the beginning. He gathered followers, but here's where he differs from the current leader. He felt that he should build a following, build a capability, and then when they're ready, seize the territory and become independent. Unfortunately, in around 2008, he started recruiting from among the Nigerian military. And he started, in 2005, he started recruiting from other Islamic groups, mostly Arabs. And the reason is they brought with them money and tactical expertise he didn't have. And then he started recruiting from the Nigerian military.
So why would he recruit from people that are other ethnic groups? So did the doctrine evolve and change?
Possibly. What's more likely is, once again, it's a matter of convenience. They had things he could not provide. They had tactical expertise, weapons training, how to build bombs, how to organize units for combat. So he was recruiting from groups like Ansari Islam, the FOS, which was a group in Algeria, and their inheritors, the GPSC. And the idea was to build a capability, and then when they're ready, be in position to go. The problem was, when he started recruiting in the military, the government suddenly saw him as more than a nuisance. Prior to 2008, they occasionally attacked churches, they occasionally attacked schools, but they never killed more than 1 or 2 people, and most of what they did was just burn the buildings and the books. When they started recruiting military members, on the other hand, the government suddenly recognized him as a threat, and they rounded him up, and many of his key leaders, in fact, all but one of his key leaders were rounded up. And the rest is a little murky. The government says he was killed when they took over his headquarters building. His followers say he was killed by the police in his cell when they tried to rescue him from the jail. And about 1,000 followers attacked the jail. Now, at that time, Boko Haram had maybe a dozen firearms in its possession, mostly handguns taken from policemen. Most of the people that attacked the jail were armed with spears, machetes, knives, bow and arrows. And of course...
So you're not talking about an elite fighting force. You're talking about a ragtag group of people that they're trying to just achieve some sort of goal.
Very committed, very courageous. Over 700 of them were killed. They didn't successfully rescue anyone, the leaders anyway, as they believe, and I happen to agree with them, the police probably killed them in their cells. With his death, there was then a struggle for leadership, and the man that rose out of that was a man named Abubakar Shekau. And he is much more militant. He has a much narrower ideology. Most Nigerians, indeed most African Muslims, are Sufi, which is a spiritual, the most peaceful component of Islam. Shekau was a loner. He's a Salafist. He believes in violent jihad. And he believes in the revolution starting now and continuing until final victory. So the group became more aggressive. Now, it's split up into 2 sections.
I have a question. So you're saying that most Africans are Sufi. What are you including
Most
in
African
that?
Muslims are Sufi.
Most African Muslims, correct, are Sufi. Are you including North Africa in that description, in Egypt,
Actually, the Sufi
Libya?
Muslims reach all the way across northern Africa and into northern Somalia. Most of the population of Puntland, which is a province in Somalia, and most of the Muslims in Djibouti are Sufis, as are most of the Muslims in Ethiopia. So in terms of schools of Islam, Sufi is the dominant school in Africa.
Do you know this? Why is, if so many, in East Africa, you're talking Somalia, Ethiopia, most of the Muslims are Sufi. There's a really big problem in the Arabian Peninsula of people from East Africa coming over to Yemen and radicalizing.
They get radicalized.
They get radicalized. Why is that? Do you know?
Because most of the Muslims in Yemen are Salafi. Salafi is a very strict form of Islam, and it believes in jihad.
Is it the same as Wahhabi?
Similar to Wahhabi. Not all Salafis are Wahhabi, but all Wahhabi are Salafis.
Okay. And can you define Wahhabi?
Yeah, Wahhabism is a very strict, conservative sect of Islam based originally in the Wahhabi tribe. It's actually the name of a tribe that gets its name from its founding leader in the 18th century. And the Wahhabis believe that only through total commitment to Allah and the exclusion of all other religious beliefs can want to send to heaven. Although in theory, now, Wahhabism was originally, although radical in terms of its commitment to the Quran, when they, for example, when the Wahhabis conquered Mecca in 1922, they took away all the decorations from Muhammad's tomb because they believe there should be no adornment on anything religion.
Okay. On that note, we're going to cut to a break. We are on Twitter at ThinkTech Hawaii. That's ThinkTech HI. And we'll be back in a minute.
Aloha, I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and I host Sustainable Hawaii every Tuesday from 11 a.m. to 12 noon. My guests offer insights on challenging economic and environmental issues facing our state and offer innovative solutions to increasing Hawaii's long-term sustainability. Recently, we've been focusing on sustainable land development, food, and energy security. If you have a project or issue you'd like to discuss on the show or would like to be a guest, please contact me at kirstenbturner@gmail.com and tune in live weekly or view the show at your convenience at thinktechhawaii.com. Mahalo.
Aloha, I'm Carlos Juarez, host of Global Connections, and I want to invite you to come join us. We cover a range of global issues. We bring a lot of expert opinion, a lot of issues, whether they're contemporary events happening in the world or maybe looking at things from a more historical perspective. Global issues, very important for us to understand in this globally interconnected world. Join us here on Global Connections.
Welcome back to the whole gamut. I'm here with retired Navy Captain Carl Schuster, military historian and modern military and terrorist, and he just knows everything, pretty much. Most of everything.
Fake it for up to half an hour.
So we ended the first section of our show with a break discussing Wahhabism. And so our show right now is about Boko Haram, and we've been kind of talking about Sufism, which is a very peaceful form of Islam, is the main form of Islam in Africa for African Muslims. And what we left a note on is people from Somalia and Ethiopia who are Sufi are going to Yemen and becoming radicalized. Why is that?
Well, part of it is when in the 1990s, when Somalia collapsed, the groups that stepped in to provide public services and take care of people were funded by Wahhabis out of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates.
And this is a common trend with extremist Muslim groups, where they've come in. This is how Hezbollah in Lebanon has become so popular. I mean, your refrigerator breaks down, who do you call? You call Hezbollah. Hezbollah asks you to help them fight a jihad, you go help them. I mean, it's kind of it's a relationship. So this is how, so you're saying this is how extremism has made it into East
Exactly.
Africa.
And the other thing about Wahhabism that's kind of ironic is prior to around 1991 or 92, Wahhabism was very respectful of Judaism and Christianity.
Oh.
All that changed in the 90s, and unfortunately I'm not expert enough to say
Right.
what caused it, but for example, the Wahhabis used to cooperate with Israel against a terrorist group, the PLO,
Right.
because the PLO was secular and atheistic in the eyes of the Wahhabi. And the Wahhabis are very respectful of peoples of the book, which is Christians and, of course, Jews. Somehow, between 1990 and the end of that decade, a radical element rose within Wahhabism, and it's now a debate on whether it's the dominant component of Wahhabism or not. You'll find, for example, the Saudi royal family is Wahhabi by marriage.
Right. But they're very collaborative with America,
Exactly right.
Israel, especially in some of these
And so
larger
most
fights.
people would argue they're traditional Wahhabis. So what you have is the radical politicized Wahhabis is largely responsible for the radicalization, the jihadism. The conservative, pragmatic Wahhabism is no longer the dominant group, although it holds secular leadership in the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia spends a great deal of effort within Saudi Arabia containing and trying to restrain and defeat radical Wahhabism or militant Wahhabism, because they see it as a destructive force. It's also a threat to the royal family, which is, of course, also a concern.
Right.
And that radical Wahhabism, which enjoys some support within the Saudi royal family and the UAE royal family, is part of the reason that you get such radical Islam in Somalia. It was actually Osama bin Laden himself that opened that door.
Mm-hmm.
When he was in Sudan, he funded a radio station in Somalia that espoused his version of Islam, which is a very radical form of Wahhabism.
So I think this is a very important point about Islam, where it is not an inherently violent
No.
religion, which is the misconception that most Americans hold. There are different sects of Islam, and right now it is going through this radical period. You know, it's going through their dark ages. I mean, we had our dark ages when, in the Middle Ages, when Islam was at its height and it was the center of the artistic and scientific world. And now the Western world has actually switched places. The Western world, we're at this great place of arts and science and global trade and power. And the Muslim world is kind of collapsing on itself, and in chaos comes violence, in chaos comes extremism.
To a great extent, I think here's the difference as I see it. Sufis focus on the positive section, what we would consider the positive section of the Quran, the sections that talk about working with other groups, tolerance for peoples of the book, and the spiritual portion of the Quran and the Sunnah. Salafists, on the other hand, focus on the militant part of the Quran. When Muhammad was expanding the religion through military conquest and the rules of thumb he had to apply to achieve it. And so the Quran is much like the Bible, although Christians and Muslims would be insulted by my saying that, in that you can cherry pick what you need
Right.
out of the Quran just as you can out of the Bible. And so what you have is differing interpretations and differing focuses on the Quran, the Sunnah, which is the teachings of the Prophet, and of course the Hadith, which is the lessons of his followers. Those are the three dominant books in Islam for studying the religion and studying Allah and Islam.
So in the case of Boko Haram, it seems that Islam, originally it started, okay, we're going to try and be good Muslims, but now it just seems to be a vessel through which Boko Haram can earn money and reestablish an ethnic state. So it's not as much anymore a Muslim, jihad. It's more of, no, we want our territory back, and we're going to get in, we're going to be self-ruling, and we're going to do a lot of whatever we can to do that. And part of the way they're doing that is through fear.
Indeed.
Is they're creating a climate of fear. Can you talk about that a little
Yes,
bit?
indeed. In fact, all African ulamas, which is the religious councils and scholars, have ruled Boko Haram's religious teachings as apostate. They're heretical. And as a result, Boko Haram has decided anyone that does not agree with them is an infidel. And so they've killed at least 2 members of the Nigerian ulama in the last 4 years. And they've grown, after they split in 2010, for example, the Al-Ansari, named after the man that took that faction out of Boko Haram, wanted to stay with the original beliefs. However, of course, Abu Bakr, he has the more radical version, and he has come to dominate because he's gotten money from more violent jihadist groups. For example, one of the first things he did when he took over is he launched what most observers call the fundraising initiative, robbing banks, taking hostages, extortion rackets where they would put a cell in a village and they would charge the local village elders protection money or local businessmen protection money, stopping people on the roads to charge road taxes and things of that nature. And they also rescued about 150 followers from a jail. Their first major operation was in September 2010. They attacked a jail and released about 400 prisoners, 150 of whom were Boko Haram followers. And that success brought him more followers, if you will.
So again, they're creating a culture of chaos, violence, and anarchy, from which they can rise a new state, they can create a new sultanate.
Which he'd be in charge, of course, because they're opposed to elections. Only the most faithful
Right.
can rule, and of course, he's the most faithful.
Now, this is not, I'm not,
Mhm.
let me be clear, I'm not saying this is some sort of revolutionary, thing that people are trying to self-rule. This is a very violent,
Mhm.
extreme,
Yeah, they see themselves as, or he sees the movement as
Mhm.
revolutionary. He's the only one that speaks, and so the only Boko Haram members who've been allowed to speak away from him were those who've defected to the government or been captured by the government. And basically, he rules by fear. And so what you had was he was able to take control through a mixture of intimidation and having money, patronage, called patronage power. Bank robberies brought in money. He used that to pay his followers. Al-Ansari didn't have money to pay their followers, so he recruited people away from them. But the big thing that helped him was the 2011 fall of Gaddafi. Somewhere between 1,000 and 2,500 jihadists released from Gaddafi's jails went to Mali and joined the jihadist movement there that very nearly conquered that country. He sent 1,000 Boko Haram volunteers to Mali, and they received somewhere between 16 and 24 weeks of training. And when they came back, they were far deadlier than ever before. They had weapons, they had tactical training and technical training. So you took a group that was very committed, but almost operated on the battlefield
right, I
like
mean,
thugs.
they were using machetes
That's right.
and rocks.
Now they got AK-47s, RPGs, light mortars, vehicles with heavy machine guns, crew-served weapons.
Right. Now
And-
they've become from a nuisance to very, very dangerous.
Exactly. Suddenly, they are a very serious threat to the stability of Nigeria, and the government found themselves shocked by how fast it happened. For 4 months, Boko Haram was quiet in 2011, 2012. And so the mindset was, oh, they've gone away. And then suddenly in the fall, they became ever more deadly and ever more aggressive and ever more proficient. And so the government's plan of treating it as a law enforcement problem went out the window. They started mobilizing the military to go against Boko Haram. And to give you an idea of what it was like, late 2011 to early 2012, they killed over 3,000 people in 11 major attacks.
Wow.
Some of them were bombings. Some of them, though, were hit and run raids where they'd roll in, hit, leave bombs behind, and then when people, came back to the village, you had random bombs going off and killing people, stopping people on the road, wiping out busloads of people, roadside bombing against buses, or they'd go into a school, kill all the teachers, kill the community leaders, anyone they felt was an impediment to their
This is really
establishing their
terrifying
control.
for the average citizen in these countries. I mean, so they're mostly doing these activities in Nigeria and Niger. What do you know the ethnic majorities and do you know about the political parties there?
Many are Hausa.
Okay.
There's about 21 tribal and ethnic groups
Oh
in
my
the area.
goodness.
The Hausa are the largest, and indeed Boko Haram is actually a Hausa word.
Okay.
It means Western knowledge is forbidden.
Right. Haram being an Arabic word meaning forbidden.
Indeed. The actual title of the organization translates to people committed to the propagation of the Prophet's teachings and jihad. And so there's kind of a difference. There's what they call themselves, and then Boko Haram is what everyone in the region calls them. The acquisition of weapons, cash, and training escalated the threat geometrically. And 2012 was the harbinger of what would come. They actually reached their peak in 2014. But until then, for example, if we go to the map that shows the areas under attack.
Okay, what map is that? Slide 10. Can we
yep.
put up slide 10, please?
The red stars show the attacks in 2010. You'll notice there are only about 4 or 5 major attacks. The little purple boxes show you what happened in 2011 and 2012. And then the red circles, the numbers of attacks were too big for me to depict on the map, so I simply encompassed the geographic area contained. And so you can see their area of operations expanded tremendously in 2012 to early 2013. The dashed red line shows the territory they gained control of in 2013. That's when they reached their peak, between November 2013 and October 2014.
So why is it during this time they expanded so much?
The Nigerian army didn't take them seriously. Also, they were able to exploit some corruption in the Nigerian army.
Right.
For example, they bought uniforms from a Nigerian general, and they bought some Nigerian military equipment. That allowed them to infiltrate 2 Nigerian military bases and shoot them up for about 2 to 4 hours each. And then they escaped into the Kamsin forest, which is along the Cameroon border. And through a series of attacks, they gradually expanded their territory. The result is the government declared a state of emergency in northeast Nigeria in September 2013, consolidated all the army units under the 7th Division, and contacted their neighbors and said, we need a regional adjustment to this, or a regional answer. And the neighbors responded because they ambushed a police patrol in Cameroon, and they ambushed an army patrol in Niger. And so Chad, Cameroon, and Niger all agreed to cooperate against the group, cut off their arms supplies, and encroach on their territory.
Wow, this is fascinating, and it's so interesting the different parallels you see with other parts of the Muslim world. But we have to take another short break. Stay right where you are. We're on ThinkTech Hawaii. That's ThinkTech HI. That's our Twitter handle, and we'll see you in a minute.
Aloha, my name is Jim Sean, and I'm host of a show called Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers. Each week, live streaming at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii, we interview people who have special insights into education, from early education through K-12, all the way through higher education and beyond. Both public and private are areas we're interested in. We dig deeper. We try to find out what it's really like to be involved in making change, advocating for it, how you reform, what people's philosophies are in reforming it. As I said, we're live streaming every Wednesday at noon on ThinkTech Hawaii, and later on, you can find these interviews on YouTube and on the Hawaii Educational Policy Center website. We hope you join us as many times as possible. Aloha.
Oh, sorry.
Welcome back to ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm Hillary Weinberg, your host for the whole gamut. I'm here with retired Navy captain and brilliant man, Carl Schuster.
Too kind.
So we're talking about Boko Haram,
Mm-hmm.
and let's talk about how this is affecting these countries.
Well,
How's it affecting the people of these countries?
Indeed, if you bring up the chart, you'll notice that the number of attacks has escalated till this year, and the number of killed has escalated as well until this year. But the most important statistics is the number of displaced.
Wow.
There are over 1.8 million people displaced by the fighting with Boko Haram, either by the group's depredations or the military response to it. There have been airstrikes, artillery, some major military effort. And the other thing, too, is Boko Haram has reinstated the slave trade, which is illegal in Nigeria.
Right.
And in the case of the new leader, Shakal believes that that is the traditional income for the Kanuri, and therefore, and the Europeans took that away from them, so he's reinstated it. The Quran, in the section on military campaigns, talks about how women and children captured in a military campaign are war booty. And so one of the things he's done to recruit young men between 13 and 18 years of age is he not only pays them, but they get to do whatever they want to captured populations. And he sold somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 into slavery.
This is people.
Boko Haram has.
Boko Haram has sold 35,000 people into slavery.
And they believe, for example, remember the kidnapping of the Nigerian women, the schoolgirls? Well, that wasn't the only group they kidnapped. They've kidnapped several thousand.
That's the only group, that's interesting, that's the only group that's really been so extensively reported on, because it's a, it really tugs at your heartstrings. It's schoolgirls, so they've kidnapped several thousand
people. They just haven't, that's the largest single kidnapping operation they did. They also kidnap young boys. Boko Haram's official ideology is that gays must be executed. It is the worst form of sin, and therefore it is an executable
Right,
offense.
so there's human rights offenses
Indeed.
happening, and this is something that other parts of Africa has problems with as well.
Mhm.
However, Boko Haram is expressing this in a very
Indeed. They believe in, for example, it isn't rape unless it's witnessed by 4 of the victim's male relatives.
oh, okay.
They very famously executed a young lady 2 years ago. She was raped by a man, an uncle, and she was like 13 years old and got pregnant. So they stoned her to death for adultery because she didn't have 4 male relatives to testify on her behalf. In their belief system, a woman's word in court has no meaning, has no weight. That's just one of the elements of their
That's
interpretation.
terrible.
Indeed. And they also, in addition to wanting, but here's some of the things they do that are kind of dichotomous, at least from our perspective. Gays should be executed under their ideology, but it's only a homosexual act if both participants are adults. The result is they kidnap young boys between the ages of 7 and 9 to be used by their followers who prefer young boys to women. But it's not homosexuality because the boys are not adults.
Right.
And then they're executed or somehow disappear when they turn 12
Now,
or
how
13 because
terrible
of their
is
acts
that?
before.
And this isn't something that I've heard of before. I mean, as
Hasn't
someone
he?
who reads news fairly frequently, I mean, the fact that, I mean, of course, the young woman, this is terrible and heartbreaking, but it really shows, what our media focuses on. Because that's heinous. I mean, it's taking young children and abusing them on a mass scale. So not only is this a terrorist organization, not only are they causing chaos and anarchy, they're oh my God, they're doing
Reprehensible
serious
acts.
reprehensible acts.
Indeed, and the government has used that against them very effectively.
Right.
Between their ethnic superiority mindset and their egregious behavior, they've lost much of a following. Originally, they had a large sympathetic population because that part of Nigeria has been ignored by the government for years.
Right. And poverty breeds extremism in many cases.
But because of their depredations against the local population and the fact that if you aren't a Faruni, you're dead meat in their eyes, if you will, or a slave, or certainly a subordinate, they've lost a lot of popular support. And the government has taken to videotaping.
Right.
It's rescued over 800 hostages, by the way, over the last 6 months. And they videotaped it, showed them being released, returned to their families. Only about 110 of the 200 and something schoolgirls in the most publicized case have been rescued. They think the others were probably sold into slavery in other countries. For example, ISIS believes in slavery.
Right.
And so what you have is a regional effort to contain them and a much more aggressive government campaign. And so they face united regional opposition now, and their future will largely be shaped by the regional cooperative actions and whether the momentum is sustained. Right now, the momentum's shifted against them. So it'll be interesting to see what the next 2 years accounts for. But you saw on the map their maximum territory. They've lost about 60% of that over the last 9 months because the Chadian military has covered them across Lake Chad. The Cameroonian military has driven them out of northern Cameroon, and the Nigerian military, Niger military has established a blocking position to intercept their supplies and support. And the Nigerian military has gone after their central area of support, which is northeastern Nigeria. They've not gone after the pocket that's in central Nigeria yet, because if they go after the head of the snake, the body will die. So that's the state of the campaign right now against Boko Haram.
So, wow, there's a lot of information to work with, and this isn't something that's at the forefront because we are not majorly fighting the war of terror in these countries. We are mainly in the Middle East. So how does this affect U.S. foreign policy and U.S. military action?
In our case, because Nigeria's stability is important to us from a wide variety of perspectives, most people will focus on oil. It's our number one import source. But also, Nigeria is a leading country in Northwest Africa. It, for example, has the leadership of the African Union's Rapid Reaction Brigade for Northwest Africa, which is the African Union is trying to take leadership in solving the continent's problems. And Nigeria is one of the leading countries in that.
Right.
And so
instead of relying on Western aid and intervention, Africa is becoming, coming into its own. It's actually, in a lot of parts of Africa, a lot of wonderful things are happening.
Indeed.
Economic growth is happening.
Oh,
Yet,
yeah. For example, Amazon is largely very near, approaching at least a solution to Somalia.
right,
And Nigeria is one of the leading countries in looking at what's going on in the Central African Republic and containing the jihadist threat in the Sahel, which is the area just south of the Sahara Desert. If Nigeria becomes destabilized, it affects the neighboring countries. And so maintaining Nigerian stability is a cornerstone to maintaining Northwest African stability, which is a critical component of American national security interests. Plus, if you look at where the Karuna live, you remember the map that showed the stretching across all the countries? If that movement were to suddenly spread into all the neighbors across all the ethno-concentrations of that group, you're looking at a movement that could destabilize almost all of Central Africa. They don't have enough power in numbers to control it, but they have enough to mess it up.
right. And you don't need to run a country to be able to take advantage of all its resources.
Oh, yeah. Take a look at what happened in Somalia. Al-Shabaab and the Union of Islamic Courts were never in a position to run the country, but they sure tore it up rather effectively. And it's going to take decades to recover.
So, all right, we're
That's
closing
why
out
we have
today.
80 special forces in Nigeria, training the army to improve their counterinsurgency, civic action projects and things to improve quality of life, and give the population a stake in remaining loyal and to the government.
Yeah.
So the government's also stepping in to
So-
provide better services.
We only have a minute or two left.
Yes, ma'am.
And I like to end by wrapping, kind of connecting this to some larger problems that we're having. And as well, is there any reading recommendations you'd have or resource recommendations you have for people who are interested in this? So first, quickly, how does this affect, so you just went into detail about,
Yeah.
just destabilization of Africa. So this connects to U.S. foreign policy by it's the spread of radical Islam. And if you create further destabilization in the rest of these countries, radical Islam has more and more places to grow.
To a very great extent. And the key issue here is although Boko Haram has no global agenda, it is a useful ally to those who do. And so if you can defeat Boko Haram, then you provide the keys to going after these other groups. They're very much a momentum movement, if you will. They build upon success. They draw recruits and money from success. So if a group is defeated, then while that doesn't eliminate it totally, what it does is it diminishes the prestige of the movement in that area. The problem is it has to be sustained after you defeat the group. Remember, everything has to be sustained because it can rise again if the conditions that created it are restored.
That's a great analysis and great wrap up. Now, anywhere that you got this information from that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
I think there's the best single source that I've seen is the BBC has done a very good job of building a summary of Boko Haram and its history. So has a group called Memory, which is a Canadian group that translates Arabic literature.
Okay.
They've talked about it. And also Al Jazeera has actually done some work on Boko Haram that's very good.
And Al Jazeera, I found, has done some really great reporting all over the world. I mean, not just on Middle Eastern issues, but they do a differently biased reporting than American media. So I like to personally get a different, spread out my research. But on that note, Carl, thank you so much for coming on the show
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
And we can't wait to have you back here soon.
Thank you.
And again, this is ThinkTech Hawaii, and this was The Whole Gamut with Hillary Weinberg. Thanks so much for tuning in.